Thank you. Well, you all know perhaps Max Frisch's famous phrase, "We asked for workers, we got people instead." Migration is an economic reality. It has, however, become also a cultural one, and we hear the difference between reality and also emotions. I'd like to make 2 points. One, as a historian, I would like to take a longer view and of current events back to the past, but also this provides for me a view into the future. And it's not just because I am a historian and pleading for my own field, but because history is a useful way of pondering the present. Secondly, we need to reevaluate the economics of migration and remember why people move to begin with, and also who benefits from migration. The focus on cultural otherness, while understandable, is only part of the story. But as the economic demographer who was born in Athens, Georges Tapinos, concluded, migration is, like consumption and production, a fundamental economic act. And since we are in an economic forum, I thought this was the moment to remind us all of that. The problem, I think, is the language around migration, and it has been hijacked by xenophobia in all of the countries, from Poland to the United States, to Italy and elsewhere. It emphasizes the cultural, the alien at best, but the terrorist at worst. It's combined with an economic nemesis, the fear of or the blaming of immigrants as job takers or as wage depressors. But historically, and this is true in the past as today, and it was just reminded again, immigrants have been good for the countries to which they have moved. The United States, Australia, Canada, the historical countries of immigration, including France, migration for the last 200 years. Over the long term, immigrants have settled in, they have integrated, and it takes time. As you said, it's not just a matter of weeks or a year or so, but it can take a long time, and it can take sometimes a generation or more. But above all, I think we need to examine or re-examine and think about the economic impact more closely and realize it goes well beyond the group that is the most stigmatized, and rightfully so, the exploitative traffickers and human smugglers. We might want to remember with a smile that in the 1970s there was a great debate over whether or not migration was marginal or structural to capitalism. I think the decades have shown us there's no question that migration is structural. It is a structural phenomenon, and it's not going to go away. So border controls can only be part of the answer because it's not going to go away. It's an economic act, and it's an economic act at different levels. And I think we also need to think about migration, again, at these different levels and try and combine them. Clearly, the perspective that is the most prevalent today is the perspective of the countries of immigration. But we need to think at the macro level of the states, also at the micro level of the individuals and of the migrants. Individuals, too, are rational actors, and the reason people are moving is both economic and rational. It's also sometimes due to terrible duress. But it's not the poorest who migrate, and this we know historically. People need capital, they need social capital in order to be able to move. So different migrants at the individual, at the micro level, have different needs, but also states at the state level have different needs at different times. States have wanted cheap labor, employers have wanted cheap labor, small businesses have been, and this was, if these are indeed all Albanian hotel owners, this is interesting to know. Immigrants create small businesses at a much greater rate than natives in most places today. This was true in the past as well. States and employers have also wanted skilled workers. The skilled workers, going from nurses to tech workers today, doctors. This creates the problem of brain drain, which Tsipras mentioned the other day. But at the same time, I think we need to consider all of these aspects of the economics of migration together. If we look at individuals, it's one thing. If we look at the states, clearly it's another thing. And then there are two different kinds of states. There are the states of departure, and there are the states of arrival. Again, the focus has been almost entirely in the discussion on the states of arrival, who feel embattled, but the states of emigration, we know there's been a lot of study recently on remittances, on transfer payments. Immigration for the states of arrival save costs of education. Tapinos, in his 1975 book on the economics of international migration, tried to set up a sort of a balance sheet between the advantages and disadvantages for the countries of emigration and the countries of immigration. He concluded that there was no one figure that was possible. But nonetheless, we need to think, and I think we need to incorporate the questions about the states of origin as well as the states of arrival, and not just focus on the problems of the states of arrival. For a large number of what one could call intermediary groups, the migration industry has been very lucrative. It continues to be lucrative. Migration has always been big business. Shipping companies at the turn of the 20th century were very important vectors of migration, made a lot of money off of migration. Today, it's more small-time intermediaries, traffickers. We can't put them all in the same boat, so to speak, but one needs to think about how migration has become an industry, and there are many economic interests that are involved in it. Even states that have now privatized parts of the migration function, both in terms of things such as detention centers, for example, in the United States. Prisons are now increasingly privatized. But at the same time, the costs of border control, who is bearing the costs, and what are those costs in relation to what, in effect, they're providing. The cost is high for states. The cost of the wall that Trump wants to build is huge. The states are also spending money hiring agents, hiring increased border controls, setting up the detention centers, but they're not necessarily working. The border controls in the United States from 1996 to 2016, the US spent about $20 billion on immigrant enforcement, yet illegal immigration rose to 11 million during that period. Who is benefiting in this case? In these cases, often the traffickers who used to be an individual who showed a Mexican migrant how to go through a small part that was open under barbed wire, now is making 10 times or 100 times more, helping people cross in much more dangerous conditions the desert. What we know is that the laws, in fact, are increasing the cost to migrants of migration, the costs that are both economic, physical, the amount that they need to pay, and also increasing the dangers. Historians are not supposed to provide policy suggestions, but I would like to just suggest a few things in conclusion. If you believe in supply and demand, for most of the developed countries today, and this was one of the points that was made, the time is ripe to open the doors. Unemployment is low, natural demographic reproduction is low, and migrants are following a supply and demand model regardless of the walls and of the great risks involved. And it was clearly seen in the United States after the banking crisis, 2008, 2009, immigration dipped. This was a clear correlation to the opportunities people saw were decreasing as well. Furthermore, if you believe in mobility as a positive value, and here I would argue largely that we need to think about and change the language about migration. Mobility has become the great word of heralding mobility, and yet it is disingenuous to herald a certain type of mobility that only really is thinking about goods and capital and not about people. So that if mobility is a positive value, then it has to include at least thinking about what that means for the migrants themselves. Finally, history shows migrations are not going to end. And as long as there is inequality, and as long as there are modes of transportation which will link different worlds, however precariously and dangerously, migration should be thought of as a given and not as something that's temporary and is going to go away. The effort should be made into treating it more equitably, to including both the states of emigration as the states of immigration, also a greater equity within Europe in terms of distribution and the ways in which it could be handled. But in any case, scapegoating immigrants for society's ills does not help, and history shows, does not help either the sending or the receiving societies, nor, of course, the individuals themselves.